for our final session of day 3 of the National Press Foundation Women in Politics Fellowship, we're going to be exploring the political influence of black women in state legislatures. We're joined by Nadia E. Brown. She is a professor of government and the director of the Women's and Gender Studies program, and an affiliate in the African American Studies program at Georgetown University. She specializes in black women's politics and holds a graduate certificate in women's and gender studies.
From Rutgers University. That makes sense here because they're
Excuse me?
From Rutgers.
Why do I have Georgetown? Let's start
No,
this again.
I'm from Georgetown, but my degree's from Rutgers.
Child, you have just messed me up. Can we start again?
Was
there anything I said that was
No,
wrong?
that's right. I'm just giving a shout out to my Rutgers family. That was all.
Do I need to start again? Okay, all right.
This is going to be fun.
I'm going to have to have a drink after this just to figure
Yes.
this out. Okay. Nadia is the author and editor of several award-winning books, including Sisters in the State House, Black Women and Legislative Decision-Making, Distinct Identities, Minority Women in the U.S. Politics, and The Politics of Protest, readings on the Black Lives Matter movement, among many other interesting titles. And you can read more about Nadia's extensive expertise on our website at nationalpress.org. Nadia, thank you so much for joining us today, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me, and I apologize for throwing you off with my impromptu shout out. Hey. Well, I could already see that this is a good group, so I am so excited to share space with you and talk with you a little bit about my research. So I'm going to talk about what black women add to state legislators, but particular lens of looking through the importance of diversity and thinking outside of a dichotomous, binary, either or kind of framework. So why should we care about diversity? I'm sure my colleagues have already covered some of these main points, and you all know this, but research consistently shows that when people from marginalized backgrounds enter into state legislatures and the federal legislatures, they transform how we think about politics that impact those groups. So when black lawmakers enter a legislative body, they introduce more bills and do more advocacy work for civil rights and issues affecting black people. Same with women. They do more work to advance issues that are feminist or women-centered, children-focused legislation. But there is this caveat, though, that it's not all welcome, right? And so that once these women, people of color, any marginalized group that has been previously excluded, they oftentimes are more marginalized, tokenized, and experience hardships and structural barriers that are now put in place in these legislative bodies. So I want to be able to balance this, right? And so while these underrepresented groups are there to advance the interests of previously dispossessed groups, they sometimes face backlash as being outside of the norm or kind of advancing interests that are not the status quo. So I'm going to give you some examples from my own research about how I've seen this play out and why this matters. And then also just some, like code words or tips or things to be on the lookout for that I think will make all of our analysis better, stronger, and more sharp. So these are some key terms that I think are necessary for critical thinking around issues that particularly black women advance. So the first key term is shifting the center. And this is the idea that we are moving away from thinking about a traditional subject or of experiencing a form of politics or policy. And so what other kind of groups might be impacted or can be seen on the sides are the margins. So if we're thinking about a centered group, let's say we're thinking about generic women in politics, we might be thinking about cisgendered white middle or upper class women. But what happens if we shift that center to think about, let's say, Latina trans women, right, from marginalized economic backgrounds? We ask ourselves a whole new set of questions that we might not have ordinarily thought. The next is then it's centering those differences. So it's not just enough to think about them and include this as kind of like a tag on or something that's an additional, but it is part of the analysis at its core, right? And it's trusting those voices and those experiences as opposed to finding ways to discount because they might not line up with whatever the center looks like. Another issue is this either or thinking, which is a way that we like to simplify things, right? Either it's up, it's down, it's left, it's right, it's red, it's blue. But we know that there's a whole lot of shades of purple. And we really get to the best part of our analysis when we can live in those uncomfortable zones. Another thing that my work tries to do is push back against these hegemonic norms of femininity. So thinking about the way that we use language or we center experiences or we think about a universal woman subject, it tends again to be centered on what we think, what culture describes as a typical female subject. But instead, how do we make room and expand for non-binary folk? How do we make room for people that perform gender in different ways because of their migrant status or their sexual orientation? And so when we expand this view of thinking outside of what are we thinking of women, it allows us to have, I think, a deeper connection to how culture helps us, unfortunately, to reify some things that aren't true for women across the board. And feel free to stop me if any of these, you want to talk or discuss any of these things. So the analysis that helps me do this is an intersectional lens that I'm sure many of you are familiar with. It comes from Kimberly Crenshaw's 1989 work on mapping the margins. And then this legal analysis, Kimberly Crenshaw draws on Black feminist theory to explain that if someone suffers a harm at the intersection of racism and sexism, can that harm be described as simply just traveling down racism street or sexism street? But if it happens at the intersection, it's most likely the combination of the two, right? And what this intersection is not about identities. It's about structures of power, right? And so notice I said racism and sexism and not race and gender, right? So it's really situating how social structures, political, economic, cultural structures of oppression map on to people's identities. So stemming from Black feminist theory that helped Crenshaw to articulate this critical race theory, she finds that there's no pure form of oppression, right? And so do you experience sexism because you're a woman, or is it because you're a woman who is socially located in an older woman's body, right? Is it that you're experiencing racism because you are economically marginalized in different ways, right? And so I usually tell this story to my class. One time I was going shopping in a very ritzy Target in Indianapolis where all of the basketball players' wives would go shopping, and people, they just didn't dress like regular people going to Target. And so I'm in there in the Target, and like early afternoon, I have my baby in a baby Bjorn, and we're walking around Target, we're shopping, really completely out of place. And I try this headband on my daughter's head, and I think she looks cute, and we're talking, like she's maybe like 6 months, like she's a baby. And I go to the checkout line, buy all my things, and I walk out of Target. And as I'm walking out of Target, minding my own business, there's a security guard that rushes out, right? And he's yelling, "Stop, stop, stop." And then I look down and I immediately freeze because I realize that I've stolen this headband now that's on my kid's head, right? But after me out leaving the Target is like a group of young people. And they are running out of the Target. So at this point, right, I'm starting to realize, like in my panic, that the security officer isn't talking to me. They're probably talking to these young people. Although, right, there's a part of me that was really cognizant in this Target that I'm the only Black person in this Target, right? And that if their security guard was looking at someone, he might be looking at me because of the way that race is criminalized and Blackness is criminalized in the United States. And I had also stolen something, right? So that was that too. But my motherhood status and right, my age really bifurcated me from being seen as someone who was a thief. So I give this story to say, right, that there is no one pure way of thinking about oppression or marginalization as playing a part in what happened to me that day, but it does highlight the way that our identities are intersecting. So in case you're wondering, I did not return the headband. I walked quickly to my car and I never went back to that Target ever again. All right. And so the other bullet points on the forms of right, oppressions happen in tandem, they are multiplicative, they build on one another, right? So you could think about, let's say, how right, a disabled migrant might experience different challenges navigating American politics and policies for, let's say, help navigating public education in a way that a cisgender, non-disabled migrant, right, might experience something. But the part that I spend most time in my research on is from these last two bullet points that come to us from Patricia Hill Collins, who's a Black feminist sociologist who started this work of Black feminist standpoint of understanding the social location that Black women fit in the United States in particular. And what she argued is through this class lens, or giving an example through this class lens, that Black women who are domestic workers, kind of thinking about like in the 1950s, 60s, like, less recent than now, in order to survive in that position, working in households under Jim Crow or Jim Crow-esque mentalities, had to both be familiar with white culture because they were working in a white household and had to know certain things to adapt and to live and thrive, not live, but to behave in that particular household while she was working from the 9 to 5. And then would have to kind of switch back into when she was going into indigenous Black communities and would have a different way of interacting with people, different language or ways that she would use language, different foods that she would cook. But she had to be able to understand both cultures, right? And having this partial status in the white culture, particularly as a role as a domestic, having to be attuned to what the white women that she was working for and the white woman's husband that she was also working for had expectations for her, and she'd have to navigate how to talk, how to move. But when she went into Black communities, she had to do that same kind of expectations, right? What are Black men expecting of her? How are Black women in that community expecting of her? And that experience gave Black women a different way to view how society's expectations are of them in certain spaces. And this meant that they were kind of code shifters, or they could pivot in different spaces. And so in the work that I do, I showcase how this is true in legislative spaces, right? And so Black women have to pivot in certain spaces based on their race, their gender, and other kinds of markers. So in the totality of my work, what I want to argue or hammer home is that Black women's politics are relational, right? They don't come out of nowhere, right? That Black women are always doing, operating within a context of who am I speaking to? What's important? How can I compromise to get what I want? When do I need to stand tall and kind of be more bullish in my approach? But at the heart of this, right, is this cultural understanding of who Black women are in the United States. And that's the issue, right? So it's not like these things are happening in a vacuum, but they're happening within the cultural context of which Black women have been deemed other in terms of gender, in terms of racism, in terms of sexism, in terms of patriarchy. And they know this and are thus operating as such. So I'll put a note here just to say that this, like the fancy academic language to the side, what my work really wants to do is give Black women agency, right? And so it's letting them tell their stories and how it matters for them, as opposed to somebody else telling their stories and then saying this is how that matters, right? And so letting Black women speak for themselves and explain these differences and how they're making these calculations. So I'll give you two examples. So this one is from my first book, Citrus in the State House. And I studied the Maryland State Legislature. And the Maryland State Legislature was one of the first legislatures to have a minority business enterprise, and that's just a program where businesses, minority businesses who want to work with the state can apply for this quota program to get some set-asides so that the state can leverage having minority contractors. And the same is true for the women's business enterprise. Just swap out minority for business. Okay, so the program's been going on for like 15, 20 years, pretty strong. It's highlighted in other state legislatures as a model program. When Black women start getting elected to the state house in first sizable numbers, they start getting calls from women of color business owners, and they start saying, hey, I want to apply to do business with the state. Where should I apply? Do I apply as a women's business? Do I apply as a minority business? And the women business owners were told you should apply to both. Well, that's twice the work, right? Like you're filling out twice the paperwork. You're trying to call two offices, right? It's more work. And so the Black women legislators go back to their colleagues and they say, hey, I think, you got a problem here. We should maybe think about what happens to minority women business owners. And minority men and white women were like, oh, yeah, hadn't thought of that. And that's literally what it was, right? It wasn't malicious. It wasn't, out of some kind of, ill will or bad intent. It was just something that wasn't thought about because there weren't large enough numbers, or there weren't numbers of Black women, minoritized women in the legislature that could raise this, right? And then once the Maryland State Legislature, this came to the attention of enough legislators that pushed this forward, the system has been modified in some ways. They still call it this, but it's one portal. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Yes, yeah, right. Pretty much, that's it, yeah. So another example is from New Jersey. So in 2018, this is a wrestler, Andrew Johnson, who was a standout wrestler, high school wrestler in the state of New Jersey, who made it to, and I'm not a sports girly, so if I get all of these terms incorrect, I will. Okay. So he's on like a match, a game, a meet. I don't know. He's doing this this wrestling championship of some sort, and the rules are that you can't have hair past your collarbone. So he's worn locks like mine the entire time he's been wrestling, his entire high school career, and has been in other state level championships, but this was the final. He never made it to the final. It was his senior year. And the referees, umpires, I don't know, told him that he was out of protocol and that he would have to forfeit this big final match unless he cut his hair. And so he had no idea what to do. He felt he was really distraught, but he decided that this match game meet was too important. So he said he could go ahead and cut his hair. So here you see this picture of the umpire referee cutting his hair, and he goes on to win the match, meet, whatever. So the moral of this is, people saw it, right? Like they saw the pictures of him before time. They see this picture of him, relishing in victory, but also feels like a personal defeat. And the Black women in the Maryland State Legislature start getting these, in the New Jersey state legislature, start getting these phone calls from young, particularly college age Black people, and they're saying, this is awful. This is really, really shameful, and you should do something about it. And so I talked to the prime sponsors of the Crown Act, which is it's a piece of legislation that would make it illegal to discriminate against you. Okay, you all know. Okay. And so New Jersey passes, it's California, New York, and New Jersey who passed this legislation in the first wave, like the first time out. But while it's being pushed forward by Holly Mitchell in the California state legislature, this is happening, and New Jersey doesn't really know like all the ins and outs of the bill. And so it isn't until later that these legislators start getting these phone calls that they link up with Holly Mitchell in California, the prime sponsor in California, and later on Dove and other kind of corporations that are starting to put meat behind this. But when I did the interviews, right, the Black women state legislators in New Jersey said they got this immediately, right? Like when they started getting phone calls, they were like, yes, this is a problem. But they wondered, like, is anyone else getting phone calls about this? Like, are people just calling me? So they started doing these listening tours around the state. And they found that it was a point of education, not a point of empathy or care. Because again, like almost anyone who saw this thought this was just like a horrible thing. But because these young people knew that these Black women legislators would understand and get hair-based discrimination, they were the entry point into the New Jersey state legislature that then would go on and pass the Crown Act. But what the Black women state legislators did, both in the Senate and in the lower chamber, was they brought their white male colleagues, their white women, their Black men colleagues, right, Latinas, they brought them to all these listening tours. Because we already know this, but I'm making space for you to come in front of people that you probably would have never have come in contact with, to have this really intimate conversation around the politics of hair. And so this example showcases how legislators and constituents connect to one another on things that don't necessarily seem to be important in the same way that, let's say, fixing legislation that would allow people that are unhoused to get quicker access to state services, right? Like you can think about some levels of hierarchies of what's most emergent. But this was really important symbolically and also practically for a lot of residents of New Jersey. So this last, and I'm sorry the text is so small, I couldn't think of like a nice graphic for this, but this is from a project that I'm doing with colleagues Anna Mitchell and Chris Clark that supported through a fellowship, a grant through the Center of American Women in Politics on Black women's roles in legislative caucuses. So this idea is that, right, Black women can join women's caucuses or Black caucuses, and then what are they doing, right? Like, are they bridges? Are they bringing together these two caucuses? Are they facing these kind of pushbacks? And what we've been finding that there's these really interesting ways that Black women are pushing and challenging the single access identity caucuses, and they're bringing people aboard. So this is an interview with the Louisiana State Legislature, and I won't read all of this, but it's really interesting that the Women's Caucus in Louisiana, because they are mostly Republican, really didn't want to pass this Equal Pay Act, Equal Pay for Women, because it was seen as detrimental to business. So the Women's Caucus was like, I don't think so. And so what the Black women in the Louisiana caucus did was they went to Black men, because they knew that Black men could not go home to Black moms, to Black wives, to Black daughters and say, I don't support equal pay. And so that's how they got the critical mass to do so. That puts pressure on the Women's Caucus. This next quote is from the delegate in the Maryland State Legislature. And she wanted to pass a bill with the Black Caucus with the Women's Caucus support, to give more benefits, or kind of like highlight the role of home health workers who are, it's minority, like it's a majority feminized labor force that are making little to no money, and they are, again, like usually ethno-racial minorities. And the Black Caucus didn't think that this was something that they should get behind, because how many people did it really impact, right? And so they teamed up with the Women's Caucus to put pressure on the Black Caucus to say you need to support these bills. So in both of these situations, right, we know that legislation only makes it through when you have critical mass of people, legislators that will support a piece of legislation. And what Black women are doing here are trying to find these coalitions that will work within what's supposed to be an already set coalition that doesn't always see things that way. So to conclude, because of Black women's lived experiences, they bring this different lens of policy making, right? They get to advocate, champion, or even present new issues in ways that other people in the legislature hadn't thought about. And they also face some of these unique challenges, and I could talk about that later, but I know I'm running over time. But the last 2 points, are I think the bigger picture, right? Is that deliberative democracies just do better when they're more inclusive, right? And so there's more voices at the table. We get to ask new questions. We get to understand how policies hurt or harm some people in ways that probably weren't thought about when they weren't there. And that it's a net benefit when there's more people at the table, because then government can respond to things in ways they couldn't if they didn't have those people at the table. So I'll end there. Oh, that's super small. But my email is, is nadia.brown. Yes, nadia.brown@georgetown.edu. Okay, thank you.
Any questions?
Okay.
Hi, my name is Shaylee Rager. I'm with Montana Public Radio. And I was thinking about when you were talking about Black women having agency and telling their stories and not having that told for them. Something I think, especially female journalists, we think about is it is our job to tell other people's stories and to try to get it right and to try to also let them feel like they have their agency, and also do our job of having like the subjective view of, you know, what we're doing. And I guess I'm curious if you have advice for us on how to make those interviews maybe feel like we're giving more agency and doing better with that process.
That's a great question. So I'm a qualitative researcher. I do interviews and ethnographies, but I'm not a journalist, right? But the part that I do know is that when I speak with Black women legislators, I try to use some journalistic techniques, like repeating back what they've said in a different, did I understand this correctly? And I also want to be, and I know that helps a lot. I mean, that puts people at ease, like let them know that I'm an active listener and I'm really trying hard to get your story correct. I don't share my work with them before it comes out, right? So I know that's something also that that you do. But I want to show on the front end that I care. And so I usually send, like, I've written these things before, like, here's my, like, I want you to know that I don't want to be extractive, that I would actually like to have a relationship and I value your expertise. And that, I think, goes a long way in building rapport, but also, it's just like, for me, like, it's a Black feminist ethic of taking care of the people that are taking care of me, right? And so I always want to assure people that I will not intentionally twist what you say, and that I value your perspective, even if it doesn't map on to the narrative that I think I'm going to tell in this piece, but it plays a role in my greater understanding. So maybe, I don't know, I'm assuming that you're probably already doing a lot of that, so, okay.
In a conversation that I had with a couple of friends recently, we really took a deep dive along those lines about the set of expectations and pressures and obligations that some Black women who pursue politics or are in their communities face. And I wonder what your thoughts are about that, particularly in this cycle, particularly after people like Stacey Abrams, who is just champion this and all gets so close and doesn't. But where are we in terms of whether or not you feel that's just a trope, or if there's something to it? I
I mean, I think it's both. I think it's a trope that has something to it, right? And so it builds on this long-standing, stereotype that Black women are do things or care for everyone else and put themselves last, right? And the part that I think that's could be seen as the truth or more to it, right, is that the numbers don't play out in the ways that we would like them to, right? So so the part that I kind of usually end with are tweets. Well, back when Twitter was Twitter, not X, but there were tweets, right, that Black women, politicos and activists were saying, right, like, stop thanking Black women, vote them in, fund their campaigns, do these things. But that was back, really, like, the height was like 20, not the height, but we saw the beginning of this in 2018 after Doug Jones, right, in Alabama was voted in because of the persistence of Black women. And in 2024, right, like, how far has that gone? We don't have a permanent, we may not, have a Black woman in the Senate after LaFonza Butler, leaves. Hopefully Lisa Blunt Rochester might be like a solid deal, but, in Maryland, we thought that was going to be a sure shot too, right? There's still no governor, right? Like, there's all these other things that are saying how far have we come, or the way that, like, we could think about your example of Stacey Abrams of, putting herself on the line for voting rights. And again, it was a difficult re-election. You're running against an incumbent who was well liked, right? So all the things that we know matter, but still coming up short in Georgia. But the point that I'm more concerned about is that this election cycle, we're not going to be thinking about thanking Black women. Because the midterms of 2022 election, the story was on Gen Z and, like, kind of how younger Americans were voting, and are they the swing voters? And there was really little discussion around, who are young voters, right? So, like, young voters are also Black women, right? Like, it was really kind of like this either or back to this either or thinking, and I think that allows. That narrative pushes Black women back into the shadows, right? And it underestimates all the work that they are doing. And I'm afraid that this narrative for 2024 will go back to erasing Black women. I'm thinking in particular, right, around, we're talking about women's issues and centering Roe or Dobbs. And the face of this then becomes, right, a middle-class white woman who is fighting for her daughter to have more rights than she did, right, or have the same rights than she did. And not thinking about reproductive justice, right, or a holistic way in which, marginalized communities think about abortion care. That's my big fear, right? So I'm like, do you want to go back into the trope or be completely erased? And I feel like America can't, like, walk and chew gum at the same time, and it's either one or the other.
Hi, Ariama from Amsterdam News. I just wanted to go off, like, the Stacey Abrams thing, because it occurred to me, you were talking about politics of appearance, like, with your book. And I had heard during that time, like, when she was trying to be, vice presidential candidate, and a lot of people were saying, well, she doesn't really look like the right kind of Black representative, and Kamala Harris is much more appealing because she's, like, ambiguously ethnic or Black or whatever, which is probably much more colorist than anything. But right. I was wondering if you talked about it or had thoughts about it.
No, that's actually like what set off that book was the comparison between Stacey Abrams and Kamala Harris, right? Because it is colorism, but it's also a negation of the role of descendants of slaves in the United States to immigrants that are at different levels, right? So it's race, it's class, it's phenotype, right? It's all of these things mixed into one. And for both of them, right, they're not biological mothers, right? So that gives them both, a different leg to stand on in gender politics for women. Although Kamala Harris is mama love, right? She's a bonus mom, but right, but that Stacey Abrams isn't married, Kamala Harris marries later, but right, they both are transgressing certain norms within womanhood that make them both somewhat problematic. But get at your heart, right? There's so many other critiques that we could be making about who they are because of what they look like and where they came from.
Hi.
Yes.
I don't know if this is on. Okay, hi. My name's Jeanette Didios. I'm a radio reporter for KUNM in New Mexico. And I was wondering if you could talk more about the power, bringing back power to people of color when it comes to their own issues. Because in New Mexico, we tried to pass this bill in the state legislature about creating a tribal education trust fund, which would create a trust fund to create funds and resources like providing language programs or buses to bring children in rural areas. And I've talked to indigenous lawmakers in my state, and they said, as a Native American, we know how to educate our children, so let us do it.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I think part of, so a couple of interesting things. So I just did some survey data, used some survey data to find that, I mean, we know that trust in American institutions are at an all-time low, but trust in media is doing this weird thing for communities of color, where there's a recognition that that media is biased, right? You can either be like, Fox News or MSNBC, and so there is a real opening for news outlets that are indigenous to those communities, right? And so I'm like, the Amsterdam News is here, right? Like, so like, this is a time I think when we should be looking to those outlets as a leader, because if marginalized Americans, in particular, aren't trusting these other sources, but they know and recognize sources that have been in their communities, that have reporters that live in their communities, that are from that background, right? So it's getting that information through there, and then it's that didactic relationship where they're talking with the community and about the community. Then they're funneling things up, I think, to lawmakers and candidates, because the issues that in my survey in particular that Black women have, no one's talking about, right? And you would think, oh, we mentioned Black maternal health, so feel good about that. But we're like, yeah, and, right? I have these other issues that, that aren't being addressed. But where they're being addressed are not in, the Washington Post or, whatever, like the local papers. And so I'm wondering, so this is just what the survey is saying, and that's my research report. But I'm like, okay, what's the next step, right? So is the next step trying to use those platforms to be more engaging with lawmakers, or is it to be more engaging with more mainstream media outlets? Like, I'm not sure what it is, but I guess the point that I'm trying to say is, I think all of those things are correct, but maybe we're looking in the wrong places to have them, and we could be putting more emphasis, because we already know, right, that trust in news is down. But if there is trust somewhere, why don't we work on those spaces, as opposed to thinking about how can we hire, more people at a news organization that people already are kind of distrustful of. I don't know, as says the political scientist. So take that with a grain of salt.
Hi, Kadia Goba with Semaphore, and I was wondering if you ever go over in your talks double consciousness and how, the perception of seeing, as a Black woman, seeing yourself through various different lenses as well as a Black woman, and how that might have impeded lawmakers moving forward. I know how it probably impacts journalists or just anyone you've come across in this, in your studies, in your realm.
Yeah, and so the way that so double consciousness is a theory that W.E.B. Du Bois coined, I think in 1910, where he says that Black Americans, he doesn't use that term, but I think it's, but anyway, but in essence, like, Black people, don't feel like completely at home, right? Like, are you American or are you African, right? And then you have this piece of you that just kind of floating around, and you're trying to like navigate both parts of who you are. And so in my work, I find that Black women definitely feel this, right? and it's calculated. So they decide how to use what part at what time. And it's like a political superpower, right? And so, for example, one of the women that I spoke with is a very light-skinned African-American woman with like light brown hair. And people have no idea what she is, like what race she is, right? And so she uses that ambiguity to her advantage, but she always knows that I'm a black woman, right? So I'm in this space, I'm going to speak up and talk about black women. But if, a Latina, if people think that I'm Latina at this event, it is what it is, I'll correct them when it's in my favor. Not that she's like pretending to be something she's not, right? Yeah, but her response to me is like, it's a political tactic. So she was more, I think, cognizant of it because of her phenotype and how she was able to pass and kind of like be this ambiguous thing, a person, not thing, I'm sorry. But everyone that I spoke with does it in varying ways, right? And so for an example, there was another woman in the Maryland state legislature actually, who was really aware that if she changed her hair, and her hair often, as black women do, that people would come up to her and they would say, "Oh, that's such a nice hairstyle. It was red yesterday. How did you get it to be in braids today?" Right? And she'd say, "Oh, thank you." But then she would talk to them about her bill, right? And so she would use that to her advantage. Or, right, there were just, yeah, or like, or men who are sexist, right, would make comments about her dress and like her body, and they would say it in an uncomfortable but collegial way, like if that makes sense. Like, you ever had like a skeevy colleague who like is always on the border? Like this, right, yeah. And so she would say she would take those opportunities, right? She's like, if I put this on today, I know that these people over here. And so she would use that to her advantage, right? And so by talking to them about, like, I'm an ally with you, because there are certain people that, as a black woman, she said, I'm never going to have access to, right? Like a Republican from Western Maryland is never going to come and talk to me if I'm representing Baltimore County as a black woman. Like, they're just not going to do it. So part of that, like, two-ness, I saw them using that as their political advantage of being able to read the room, because they didn't feel necessarily like they fit in all of the ways, but they found ways to work it to their advantage, if that makes sense. Yes.
Hi, my name is Samia. I'm from Cal Matters in California. I think something that I run into in writing about representation is like guaranteed every story I'll get an email saying, well, representation doesn't matter because California has a Democratic supermajority and whatever the Democratic leadership wants happens. So I was wondering if you could speak to those dynamics of representation versus the power structures in place.
Yeah. They work hand in hand. And I think it's great that you get those questions, because I think at least like voters are cognizant enough to know. But I think the part that the background that they're missing is the Democratic Party is a quote unquote big tent, right? And so if they are trying to represent marginalized, or if they're trying to represent more than just, right, like a small group of people, it does matter. Representation does matter, right? It would be a different story if you were in the Republican Party, right? So the party ethos about who the party sees themselves as is part of that particular story. And so there's a book, Laurel Elder's The Partisan Gap, that I like. It's like a really easy book to read. I signed it for my undergrads. But she walks out kind of like the Democratic Party culture and why like identity matters for the Democrats, right? And so why descriptive representation is something that we should be thinking about, particularly in this party, right? And why we don't see it in the Republican Party. Other books have done this, but this is just like a really easy kind of like primer to read. But anyway, so structure matters, of course, but the people who make up the party also matter. And so it's not a linear argument. Maybe it's a little bit kind of like circular, but all those pieces have to fit together. And so maybe I would remind readers that, yeah, they're super majority, yeah, whatever the party wants. But let's say who's in the party leadership, how'd they get there, who are they representing, like what power did they broke, what constituents are they leaning on to make sure that they get to stay in power, right? Like these things all matter.
We started today talking about harassment and threats to women in politics. And again, having a discussion with one of my friends about that issue. And I was born in 1961 and in a very racist sort of atmosphere. So it's almost as if my parents sent me out into the world being prepared to be harassed and threatened and mistreated. But I wonder, from your perspective and research in this field, talk about the impact of harassment and threats for Black women in politics, and whether it is really reducing the field of potential candidates.
So most of the research on gender and political violence is done outside of the U.S., right? And so a colleague at Rutgers, Mona Crook, is the expert on that. And we're slowly turning to this in the United States. A colleague also at Rutgers, Paru Shah, and I just have a new grant project that's looking at violence against minority women in politics. And so I do Black women's politics, Paru does Asian American women's politics, and what we both found in our independent work, which made us want to work together, is that these groups of women just aren't believed, right? Which is a big, all women usually are not believed around like violence and harassment, but it's a big difference when there's already a trope out there that these women are expendable, that they have this voracious sexual appetite, or that they are
naturally tough.
Yes,
strong.
right, like all of these things, right? So all of these stereotypes, whether, play for Black women or for Asian American women, right, they play into how they're experiencing gender-based violence. It's distinctly racialized, right? And other research from the Brennan Center that came out maybe like a month ago, it's looking at state legislators, found that it was prevalent amongst both parties, right? But really Democrats are getting the brunt, getting more of this. And the part that they are concerned about is that we probably will not see a lot of young women enter into politics, because like, why, right? If you're seeing this, why do it? And there are some structural things that I think we could make a difference on, like, why can't you use campaign finance to fund security for yourself? Could there be, measures that will protect people in state houses, as opposed to like, sure, we're an open carry state. Come on in the state legislature, right? Like, there's a whole lot of, these things I think we could actually do. But in some, right, yeah, Black women experience sexual harassment, gender-based violence as political candidates in ways that other groups do not. And this has an impact. And the research that I've done, it takes things like Ayanna Pressley, who suffers from alopecia, like already had alopecia, right? Like, but the last strand of her hair falls out during Donald Trump's first impeachment. It's not a coincidence, right? It's brought on by stress. And she's already receiving death threats. Her staff are receiving, death threats. She's trying to protect them. And what could have been a slow process of all of her hair falling out because of the disease turned out to be, almost overnight. So there's so many ways that not just going into politics impacts people, particularly, right, Black women. But I want scholarship to do more of understanding what political violence does to change the landscape of American politics and the candidates that are running.
Hi, I'm Jackie from Florida, Phoenix, and I'm wondering if you've been able to talk to any Black Republican lawmakers in state legislatures, and how their experiences vary, and what conclusions you've drawn from those interviews.
Yeah, so Black Republican women are super hard to speak with. I don't know if other people have had better luck than I have, but I've spoken to two in my entire career. It's like they're really, I know, like I've gotten emails back that they don't trust that, like as a researcher, that I'm going to present them in a light that they would like to be presented in. But when I have spoken to them, and it might be the ones that I'm speaking to are nut jobs, right? So like they're not.
No, really. What do you mean? I'm not.
You know, so I'm like, I don't know. But I mean, but there's something there. So I think if if the 2020 election, right, saw the largest increase of minority Republicans running, period, right, like ever in history, well, outside of like Reconstruction, when like before party alignment, and a lot of them were women, and that wasn't the story because, right, Donald Trump was running. So I think that if it were a different, political climate, that we probably would have had like, different conversations, and perhaps these women would be more willing to talk. So what I've done to interview them. So what I've done to get around that is my grad students and I have, MJ scraped Twitter and got all of their tweets, and so you can see kind of what their messaging is or was, and what's different about Black Republican women than Black Republican men candidates are that they were more likely to trying to be consensus builders, right? They understood that being a Black Republican was something of an oddity in some Black communities. So they wanted to be able to make inroads with Black people who hold conservative issues but vote Democratic, and do so under these traditional norms of like, this is what women bring, or this is why you might want to be a Republican. It wasn't as bombastic as what Black Republican men were doing, which was a lot of like loud yelling at crazy things. So at least their Twitter, right, they appear to be more normal. A lot of them lost, right? And so whether, that strategy because it wasn't fruitful in 2020, maybe they'll try something different in 2024. But yeah, looking at Twitter, they were at least more moderated. And what they did was they really downplayed both race and gender and played up traditional kind of like family, women issues, and like Black capitalism type of things.
Great. Hi.
Hi.
Hello. April Corbin-Gurnish from the Nevada Current. One thing I've heard from our Black women lawmakers in our state legislature is that some of them struggle with wanting to sponsor and being expected to sponsor things like that Crown Act, or things that are sort of explicitly Black issues, because they're the face of that, and they're also proud of those things. But balancing that with legitimately wanting to do legislation that everybody benefits for, but that they can bring their value and their intersectionality and all of their viewpoints to. They're both equally important, right. But obviously in state legislatures, I assume all of us, there are limits to how many bills you can sponsor. There are limits to just how much capacity you have to lobby for things. So I'd love to hear more about the conversations you've had with lawmakers about how they balance those things, whether or not there are any structural things that can fix that, or how other lawmakers could step in to help, or so just to learn more about that particular conflict, which seems present.
Right. So two things were coming to mind. The first is that like these kind of issues, again, like they're expected to do, and it's kind of like their bread and butter, like the legislators that I've spoken with, right? Because they can point back for re-election purposes, right? So they can point back and say on their record, I've done what you've expected me to do, and I've done it well, right? Because if there's consensus for these type of things, like the Crown Act in New Jersey, right, it moves through with little discussion, right? But a legislator can point that out to the community as a win, which then allows them to do some of the other things because they've proven themselves as a consensus builder, or they've proven themselves as a fighter for them. But on the flip side, when they can't do those other things, what my research with Sarah Gershon has found is that it really pigeonholes these women. So they're less likely to seek or be effective at getting higher office because they're only seen by both their constituents and by the media as people that do these niche things, right? And so it's like, why call a Black woman legislator to talk about tax policy? That's not the issue owner, that's not who owns that issue in people's mind's eye, and she hasn't done it. But she probably does have, comments on tax policy, right, that she's just not being asked. So voters don't think about Black women as these like universal like representatives. So what they found, what my colleague Sarah has found, is that a way to get around this is that minoritized legislators usually will send like a brief straight to newspapers and ask them basically to carry it as is, right? They don't want to speak. They don't want to do the interview. They just want you to run, this blanket. This is what I've been doing. And some places that are understaffed do because they don't have, they don't have the staff to do otherwise. And those women tend to also be more like combative, right? Like, so they're like, I've already been burned, so I'm gonna go send you what I want you to know. And that also doesn't do well in other kind of spaces, right? So that was one strategy. Another strategy is through co-sponsorship, and that's just showing like I'm a team player, and that helps them to move up, right? And so they build consensus, they take one for the team, or they go out and campaign or stomp from other people and are tied to those issues. They are seen as legitimate. So for those kind of issues. So that's a strategy. That's a strategy that I've seen, and it's actually playing out here right now in the Maryland State House, where Jocelyn Pena-Melnick is a Dominican Afro-Latina who is on the stump for David Trone, who is a white male Democrat who's running for office, as opposed to Angela Alsobrook, who's a Black woman who's running for office, right? So Pena-Melnick, is like, anking her, is anking her cart to that horse of Trone in a way to say, like, I care about business in these kind of ways, and not Angela Alsobrook. So that's a strategy.
We got a little bit of a late start, so we probably could take one or two more questions, if there are any.
Okay. Hi, I'm Kayla Harris from the San Antonio Express News and the Houston Chronicle in Texas. And I was wondering if in your research you've come across any differences in the way that women, and particularly Black women, approach legislating or advocacy work in Republican and Democratic states, and also specifically Republican states that have targeted Black women through like abortion bans and DEI bans and critical race theory stuff. And
Yeah. So, okay, so the first thing that came to my mind was the things that we were doing in the Louisiana state legislature, where some of the Black women Democrats are like out Republican the Republicans. So like, that's a strategy on abortion. I don't know. But some of the others, I think are, like some of the work I did, focus groups in Texas for the Politics of Appearance book, and some things that those women were doing were seeking different offices, right? So, and so this also comes out in a colleague, Pearl Dow's work, that these Black women see where they are effective and where they can make change, and they choose to put their efforts into that, as opposed to like fighting a machine that they're not going to win, right? So they see the writing on the wall. And so rather than, let's say, move from the lower chamber to the upper chamber in the state legislature, they're going to go back to their city council and try to make change in those places because they actually can. It might be, I don't think of it as like a strategy of retreat, but like, what's an effective use of your time? I talked to a woman in the Ohio State Legislature who was really impactful for her district in Ohio, but decided she was going to run for, actually it was for city council. She wasn't going to run for mayor, she's going to run for city council. It's like, it's a losing battle here in Columbus. Like, why am I doing this? I'm going to go back to my town and do this, right? And then I think sharpen skills or time changes, and then maybe she'll do something else. But she's like, I'm not going to hit my head against the wall to do this.
I was just wondering if there's anything that you see journalists doing that you think is harmful. Rachel mentioned the Black women saving democracy trope, like any kind of framing that you would like to go away tomorrow if you could wave a magic wand or anything like that.
I mean, what immediately comes to mind is like, stop talking to the crazies. I don't know, like if that's.
But
there's so many, right? Yeah, there's so many.
Also, like they represent 750,000 people sometimes. So
Yeah. I mean, but it's not like, sometimes like you're just giving a voice to folks who just want to go away. But yeah, you're right. Okay. So if we're not, yes. Right? Yeah. So how are you framing what the wackadoos are saying? Okay. So other things that I wish that would go away are some tropes, not some tropes, but just like ideas that are back to this like either or thinking, right? So like pro-choice, pro-life, voting, but like not thinking about donating money or your time, trying to conflate Black communities as one thing, or like Black women as one thing. So there's definitely differences in generations, right? Like, so civil rights generations don't think about things like millennials or Gen Zs. I mean, obviously, that might be obvious, but I think about people like Jasmine Crockett in Dallas, right? Like in the way that she is really pushing it to, I think, some older conservative thinking Black folks around health and like autonomy that's making us question respectability politics. That really shows this nuance of there's more ways to think about Black life and issues. Another one, which I'm still grappling with, is the kind of like class stratification. And like, so where I live in Maryland, like Black business enterprise is a big thing in Montgomery County. In Baltimore County, it's thinking about like workers' rights, and then how do you square that circle when there are Black people who are dealing with historic damages due to capitalism, right? Like regardless of your business owner or you're an employee, but there has to be a more nuanced conversation. And it's not that all Black people or Black representatives are pushing for pro-worker rights, right? There's some that are pushing for pro-business in ways that are trying to like kind of undo or rethink the role of like racism and capitalism. So I think it's like, it's just bringing more nuance to, like, I was thinking like there was I did this panel for Al Jazeera, and this Republican pundit looked at me on screen and was like, yeah, I know, like your community is really big on like, and at both times, right, like he was saying criminal justice, and I'm saying environment, like climate change. And I was like, like I'm really thinking about climate issues. Like I'm gonna have to live here for longer than you are, and like we're doing some really harmful stuff, right? But like he was thinking I'm gonna say like criminal justice. I'm like, yeah, I don't think about that, right? But it's like, it's those kind of ways that like we think that certain people or groups have issue ownership without recognizing like the nuance and all of these things. So maybe it's not as easy as saying like, don't say Black women can save democracy, but like, how might Black women want to save democracy if they decided to? I think that's a question. Yeah.
I'm going to end on a note that talks about honoring the past. And we know that in California, when Senator Feinstein's seat came open, there was a cohort of people who thought Barbara Lee should have gotten it automatically, et cetera. And we think of people like Maxine Waters. I mean, every woman of color in this country owes her a debt in her sort of steadfastness and speaking her mind. Is there a generational sort of shift in how Black women politicians are strategizing, moving forward? And is there a danger in not sort of remembering the past?
Yeah, I like this question. I like this. This to be thinking. So yes, there is definite difference, and I like some of this difference because it, like the energy of I'm not going to sit and wait. I'm going to do it now. I'm empowered and I'm empowering. is different, I think. And I think older Black women are also on board with that. Right? So like Barbara Lee, right, picks her successor, or we saw Edie Bernice Johnson pick her successor, right? So there is like, there is that recognition, but that these women are saying like, I'm going to start a political action committee. I'm not waiting for donors to, come to me that aren't from my community or don't think like me. I'm going to go out and do it, or I'm going to get my sister circle together and we're going to advance things. I think Black women have always done that, but I think what's changed now is technology, the digital era, and making the world a little smaller, and Black women not feeling like they have to wait in line to do this. I don't think it's necessarily forgetting the past. I think it's putting a new spin on it and not being beholden to feeling like I have to wait in line or kiss the ring. Like, if it's my time, voters will let me know.
Well, I really didn't think we could top the energy of yesterday's final session, but somehow with Professor Nadia Brown of Georgetown, we've been able to do that. So let's show her our appreciation for her.
Thank you.